George Bush gets several emails sent to him through this. He will be sent, there will be a rapture letter sent to him at the White House after the rapture, but I strongly believe that our president is a born-again Christian, and he will be in heaven also.
So he won't get the letter?
I don't believe he will, but his office will, his computer will, probably, and perhaps the secretary will. No disrespect to that secretary, whoever that is.
Do you have people in your life who you think will be getting a letter instead of being with you?
Oh yes. I've spoke to many people, and some of them till I'm blue in the face about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you know, they basically, as most people do, they believe that's good for me but not good for them, you know. And so all I can do is pray for them. And some of them I have prayed for over the years, and I see them 2 years later and they're going to church and they've become born-again Christians, and which is fantastic, and I rejoice in that.
Have you successfully converted anybody?
I actually don't convert anybody. All I can do is be a messenger, and that's stated in the Bible. The Holy Spirit actually converts people, and I cannot do that myself. But I will pray with them and pray the sinner's prayer so that they can accept Jesus Christ as their Savior.
And you have witnessed to somebody who has then converted to Christianity?
Oh yes, yes. Not a lot, but a few people. It's always a real blessing when that happens too. I'm on the prayer team at my church, and people will come up and ask for prayer. And I just remember one evening a young lady came up and said she wanted to accept the Lord as her Savior. And it's a pretty monumental moment for us, because we don't. It's like somebody coming up and saying, "You've just won $1 million." Right. We kind of relate it to that because it's a special moment.
The fine-tuning argument is the argument that the universe was perfectly finely tuned. All the physical constants were perfectly, exactly arranged to allow life to exist. Well, it's not entirely true. The physical constants were perfectly arranged to make a perfect black hole generator. And this is, for example, this is one of the little pieces of evidence that I find very intriguing. And this has been demonstrated by Dr. Lee Smolin, who showed that this universe is the best possible universe you could ever design for maximizing the production of black holes. So there's more black holes in this universe than any other universe you could come up with by mixing up the physical constants or the number of subatomic particles, which is another curious thing, that the number of subatomic particles and their properties is exactly what they would need to be to maximize black hole production. Now, if you think about it, 99.99999% of this universe is absolutely lethal to life. It's deadly radiation-filled vacuum. 99.99999% of all the matter in the universe goes to making black holes, not life-bearing worlds. I mean, for every life-bearing world, I'm sure there's trillions of black holes in this universe. So what would be the obvious conclusion? This universe was designed to make black holes. It wasn't designed for us. And Smolin also shows, by showing this, he shows that a universe that was perfectly designed to make black holes would just happen to kick up life at random. It would just happen, it's necessarily the case that the only way to make a universe that would be a perfect black hole generator is to make one that would occasionally, very rarely, create a little tiny microscopic speck of life as a byproduct. So really the Christian design argument would lead you to conclude that God built the universe for black holes, not for us, and we're just sort of an accidental byproduct, even from that perspective.
Thanks, God.
And it's so unnecessary. For example, and this is one of the things that I'm bringing out in a new article I'm writing for someone about my reasons for not being a Christian. And the opposite would be the case. If the Christian God were true, if the Christian God existed, the universe would be pretty much the way Paul and the other early Christians really thought it was. It would be one solar system, not zillions of galaxies, not billions of years old. We would have tons of evidence that we could find eventually that the whole cosmos was created, 6,000-10,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't have any evidence of evolution. They didn't know anything about evolution or the evidence for it. We wouldn't have all of these things. We wouldn't need these physical constants. We wouldn't need all these subatomic particles. We would only need the 5 elements that Paul and Aristotle thought there were, not the 90 or so elements that we've actually found, and so on and so forth. The Earth would be the center of the universe. I mean, why would God make it any other way? I mean, it's the center of his attention. It's the purpose for which everything was created. It makes sense that he would make it the center of the universe, and that's what Aristotle and Paul and everybody thought. Is like, well, yeah, it makes sense. Well, it turns out not to be true. So the universe we would expect, if the Christian God existed, is not the universe we get. We get this really bizarre, extremely strange, complicated universe that's almost entirely devoted to producing black holes and is actually optimally arranged to produce black holes. The human brain has to be really huge, has to be really large to be able to perform this complex function called consciousness. But it's so large, it has to be so large, in fact, that it kills 1 out of 5 women who give birth without modern medicine to help them. So that's a really messy design, a bad design. I mean, you wouldn't want to make something that babies kill their mothers 1 out of every 5 times. And there are many other problems.
God might have mother issues.
Yeah,
you
might
never
have mother
know.
issues. Yeah, and there are other problems. The brain is a huge hog. I mean, it sucks up all the oxygen and all the energy, tons amount of oxygen and energy. So you're wasting a lot of your breathing and eating and so forth just to feed this brain. So it's very inefficient. And it's very vulnerable to injury. I mean, it's a very delicate organ. If it gets injured, your whole cognitive functions can be hugely damaged. You can lose your sight, you could lose your reason, you could lose control of your emotions. I mean, it's a very vulnerable organ. It's not what a God would design, and God wouldn't need to design this, because if a God exists, then obviously a mind can exist without a body, because God is without a body. So we could have minds without brains. We don't need brains. God could just give us a soul, like the Christians actually think we have. And if we had a soul and it did all the actual consciousness and perceiving and thinking, we wouldn't need a brain. So we wouldn't have to kill our mothers. We wouldn't have to have this organ that's sucking up all our energy and making our bodies very inefficient. We wouldn't have this delicate organ that could easily be injured and ruin our cognitive faculties and so forth. There would be no need for that brain. But if God does not exist, in fact, if it's impossible for a mind to exist without a fleshy organ to create it, then it necessarily follows that the only way to have a conscious being is to have this large, messy, vulnerable brain. So isn't it surprising that on the assumption that there's no such thing as a disembodied mind, it necessarily predicts that the only way there could be a mind is to have this complex brain. Lo and behold, we have this huge, complex brain. And yet, on the Christian theory, we expect the exact opposite. We expect to have souls, not brains. Well, why do we even need brains? We need brains if atheism is true. So the existence of large brains is positive proof that atheism is true. But, and because, if the Christian God would build something differently. Now, the Christian will respond to try to make up excuses for why God made the brain, but, these excuses are just pulled out of thin air, and they don't really rescue the theory. It's still the fact that the only way atheism can be true is if we have these large brains. We have these large brains, that's evidence for atheism. It might not be proof, might not settle the issue, but it's evidence for it. And if God had some weird reason to do this, then it means that God had some weird reason to make the universe look exactly like it would have to look if God did not exist. And that seems highly improbable.
So atheism is a lack of belief.
Yes, that's my position. There are some atheists, well, usually it's agnostics, who insist on calling themselves agnostics, who insist that atheism is denial of the existence of God, and
No,
there are Christians
atheism
that do the
is
same thing.
An atheist is just an agnostic who's thought about it.
Yeah. Right? I would say so, and I will say, I'm an atheist partly because I'm an agnostic.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a lack of belief. There's nothing there, so why do anything, though? I don't understand. Why not? And people ask all the time. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I'm an atheist too, but why do you make a point of? Why do you make a crusade out of it?
Well, to me, philosophy is very important. I mean, it is my religion, and I take it as seriously as a Christian takes his religion. And philosophy, to me, is the objective of trying to understand yourself, understand the universe, understand your place in the universe. And it's to understand what exists, how does it work, what do we do about it now? And that, to me, is very important. It's something everyone should pursue. I think people should abandon religion and pursue philosophy, and pursue it the way Socrates and Aristotle pursued it, with questioning, with trying to find out what the truth is, constantly questioning, constantly checking the facts, constantly trying to integrate everything into a coherent worldview. And that's what my book, Sense and Goodness, is about, is I take everything I know and I show that all this research I've done over all these years has led me to believe that naturalism is the correct worldview, and I lay out what that is and why I believe it's the correct worldview. And it leads to a lot of conclusions about what kind of political views you should have, what kind of moral values you should have, how we should investigate things, the value of science, for example. Even everyday life. I mean, how do we decide what stories we're going to believe? We're reading a journalist, listening to a politician. Everything about the way you go through life, how you decide what to believe, how you investigate claims, how you conduct your life, all comes from your philosophy of life, whether you know it or not. And that's my book is presenting the atheist, or an atheist philosophy of life. It's a view of the world that is a positive assertion about what exists and it's what the nature of it is, called naturalism. And it just happens to be an atheistic philosophy because there's no God in it. There are other atheistic philosophies, of course. I mean, people will tell you about Marxism and objectivism and so forth. I don't buy any of those. I go into naturalism, the secular, or the ethical part of which is secular humanism. And that's what my book defends. And I think it's very important for people to explore these things. And I always wanted to write this book. I mean, even from my high school days, even though I had a completely different philosophy of life then, I wanted to write a book that conveyed a philosophy of life that people could come up and go and read and decide whether, is that right or wrong, or maybe I'll change some things. That's the kind of thing I've always wanted to do, and that's what I'm doing now. And of course, through all my investigations, I've ended up in a different place than I thought I would. But yeah, that's why I do that. And of course, that butts me up against the Christians who say I'm wrong.
You wrote a review of Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle.
Right.
In which you said basically there's no good refutation of this argument. It should stand for now until there is one. Is that inaccurate?
No. What I said was agnosticism is the correct position now. What had been the problem before is that historicity is usually presumed, that if you have all this documentation of someone's existence, that's usually enough. They existed probably. And that's fine enough as far as it goes. And the Christians have some particular pieces of evidence that they can offer that support, don't prove, but support the theory that there really was a Jesus. Mm-hmm. What Doherty did was came out and explained all the evidence, even the weird evidence, which is impressive because that's something a lot of the Christians can't do. Even the weird evidence, explained it all with this other theory that entails that there was no physical Jesus. So his theory is completely consistent with the facts, which means that we can't now decide whether Doherty's right or the Christians are right. We can't pick sides yet because we don't have the evidence we need. We don't have the smoking gun. Theoretically, we could. I mean, we could find a lost letter of Paul that says, I made it all up, or that says something to the effect that Jesus didn't exist physically on earth. That could happen, and that would vindicate Doherty's theory. That would be like the extreme example. You could have other minor pieces of evidence that could tend in that direction. We don't have that yet. So my view is that we can't be sure whether Jesus did or did not exist, and that's what I argue in my review of Doherty. Since I wrote that review, however, I've been studying more the writing of the New Testament, the Gospels especially, the symbolism that's employed in the construction of the Gospels. And I did this mainly, especially when I was researching my chapter for The Empty Tomb. There's this anthology of writers on the resurrection called The Empty Tomb that's coming out in a few months. And I have 3 chapters in that, one of which is the spiritual body of Christ and the legend of the empty tomb, where I lay out all the evidence, I mean more than I've laid out anywhere else, that the original Christian belief was not that Jesus walked out of the grave. The original Christian belief was that Jesus got a new, better body and left the old body behind. The old body was destroyed or rotted in the grave or whatever. Now this view is also compatible with the idea that Jesus never existed on earth because it's the same idea. He would come down, get a body of flesh, shed the body of flesh, jump into a body of spirit, and rise again. Mm-hmm. So it's compatible with both theories. But in researching this, I studied how Mark, for example, constructed the empty tomb story. And I found some astonishing things. The sort of symbolism that he was using explains almost every detail of it in a way that you'd almost just say it's almost impossible that this would be historically true. That Mark himself probably did not believe he was writing history. He was writing a symbolic message. He was writing a gospel, the good news, and symbolizing it using biblical parallels, using parallels to pagan religions and so forth. When I saw that, and I've seen it more and more places in the New Testament. For example, even Luke, who I think really did think he was writing history, even Luke tells this story about the two guys on the road to Emmaus who meet Jesus in disguise. It's many attributes of that story are almost an exact inversion of the Romulus story. There's a story, there was the founding myth of Rome that Romulus was a god descended and became a man and founded Rome, and then was killed, torn apart by the Senate, executed, and then rose again, and then appeared to his friend Proculus on the road to Alba Longa from Rome, and told him basically, if the Romans are virtuous, they will have a great empire, and explains the whole story. I was a god, I came down to found this great empire, blah, blah, blah. And that was, they actually had annual ceremonies celebrating this myth. And the Luke story of the road to Emmaus is very similar in many respects. I mean, curious, not so similar that you go, oh, definitely that's what Luke is doing, but similar enough that it seems like Luke got the story from someone who was sort of aping this Romulus myth, but putting Jesus in place of Romulus. And instead of a worldly empire, is preaching a kingdom of God, an empire of God, a church where it would be the Spirit of Christ that would govern everyone rather than the use of force or whatever. And when I found lots of these things, and the more I find it, the more I find Doherty's theory attractive. Not proven, but it does seem that he can make a good case.
Do you sense that in some way the Christian Holy Bible is also walled off from certain kinds of inquiry, even in American academia?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's a huge amount of scholarship on the Bible, but from all kinds of points of view, this so-called higher criticism. It took a while to do it because for a long time you weren't allowed to say, for example, there were different voices. They now talk about the J and the P depending on the different word for God. Is it Elohim, is it Yahweh, and so on. And even the first person who pointed this out lost his job. It was dangerous to do this in even the history of Western scholarship. But I think in the 21st century, people are pretty free to say what they want about the Bible. People are free to reject it. I found actually the best evidence for my own research was going to Christian bookstores. And there were all these books about apparent contradictions in the Bible, seeming inconsistencies. Books and books of these things, because the Bible scholars noticed that there were these two different versions, 2 of every animal on the ark, 7 of every animal, and they were trying to work out, what was the real version. Of course, there is no correct version from a folklorist point of view. So they gave me all the evidence I needed. All I had to do was to look up the passages, and I saw, yeah, these are 2 different versions of the same story. So they were my research assistants, these people who were trying to reconcile these. I mean, was Jesus' robe purple, or was it magenta? Well, maybe the sun was shining it looked red to this one, and somebody reported. I mean, they go to great lengths to try to reconcile these apparent contradictions. So I think that we live in a pretty free society in that regard, although there are certainly schools where my approach would not be welcome, but that's okay. I'm at Berkeley, we can say what we want here. There's free speech here. We had to fight for it. So I would say that I think that we have pretty much freedom of the press and free speech in the United States on all topics, including the Bible. But it's still touchy. And there are still places, there's still, after all, religious universities, which are pretty doctrinaire, which don't allow for this kind of approach. I'm sure they'd think I'm very blasphemous to do this. But that's okay. Only have one life.
The threats you've gotten, the trouble you've been in, was that for your book on the Quran, or?
No, actually, the Quran, I had no. Probably nobody's read it. I mean, I'm probably safe. Although one Arab scholar wrote me from Hungary. He said it was a terrific book. He said, I think I'm going to try and see if I can get it translated into Arabic. I'm not sure that's such a good idea. My wife was annoyed that I dedicated it to my grandchildren, and hoped there'd be greater religious tolerance and understanding. No, the threats I got, death threats, are not so much in the Bible as in my theory of football as homosexual ritual. That got me a lot of death threats. That was more dangerous than running about the Bible. Well, that's another story that's very close to the Swiss's heart, where William Tell is their hero. And again, we have a father-son story where a father is shooting apples off an apple off the son's head. And again, you should read my essay on the subject before hearing me on it. But it's clear it has a psychological dimension, which accounts for the appeal of a threat that a father might kill a son. And it's again the Oedipal story once again. And then people say, well, how can it keep being the Oedipal story? Well, it keeps being the Oedipal story because that's the basic story of growing up, and boys admiring their fathers, but also fearing them, and also being rivals for the attention of the mother. And when daddy's out of town, I get to sleep in mommy's bed, etc., etc., etc. So, and it's no accident that Freud chose the name Oedipus for this constellation, because he recognized that the folk had already articulated it in the form of a folktale. He didn't call it a folktale. They usually call it a myth. It's not a myth. It's a folktale. It's tail type Arnold Thompson 931 in the tail type index, standard folktale. In fact, in the oral versions of the tale, it's much more explicit. When the boy who's raised by other parents grows up and comes to the town where his real mother is, she hires him to stand guard over her garden or orchard at night. And at night, an intruder enters her orchard, presumably to pick apples or something. And he, he's on guard, and he shoots the intruder, and it turns out to be his father. Well, the fact that a son shoots his father, who's an intruder in his mother's garden at night, I mean, unless you want somebody to draw pictures for you, is pretty clear. Now, that would have been a better version if Sophocles had thought of using that instead of the version that he did, because Sophocles is basically a literary version of a folktale. Sometimes what people believe is true or believe happened might be as important as what actually happened. This is like folk history being as important as actual history.
Well, how could folk history be as important as actual history?
Well, folk history is what people believe happened. So people tell stories in their families about family history, and they leave out the horse thief, and they leave out all the negative things, and they present themselves as heroic characters in their own life stories. And even in the case of George Washington, I mean, the most famous story about him is chopping down the cherry tree and confessing to his father. It probably never happened. Doesn't matter. I mean, to the folklorist, it doesn't matter. It matters to the historian. The historian's like, it's an apocryphal story. Parson Weems put it into his hagiographical study of and biography of Washington to make him a greater person. From the folklorist point of view, we don't care that it didn't happen. The fact that people tell the story, and some probably actually believe that it may have happened, is more important than the actual history, because it tells you something about the father of our country, that he didn't lie. Probably the last time that a president could say that. That's what I mean when that what people think happened maybe is as important in terms of understanding them as what actually happened, because we don't always know what actually happened. It's important for us to believe that Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. It's a perfect American success story, rising from humble origins to become president. We still like that story, although occasionally a rich person, a Yale graduate, gets to be president.
But that's not his story.
Well, that's not the log cabin story. It reminds me of the story about Richard Nixon being interviewed, like I am now, by a reporter who says, "Is it true, Mr. Nixon, that you were born in a log cabin?" And Nixon said, No, you have me mixed up with Abraham Lincoln. I was born in a manger."
I think within academia, the political correctness that surrounds our conversations about religion, the taboos that prevent us from criticizing religious belief, those have to come off. So within an academic context, I think we need to be able to really demand that people be intellectually honest. I mean, essentially, all I'm arguing for is intellectual honesty. That people cease to pretend to be certain about things nobody can be certain about, and that our convictions really just scale with the evidence. So that if you're absolutely certain, you can say you're absolutely certain. If you just think it's probably so, you can say it's probably so. And people, I mean, it's important to notice that we play by these rules in every other area of our discourse. You know, we are never admonished to respect somebody's beliefs about biology, or about history, or about physics. And what we do in those, when the conversation turns to those subjects where there really is a domain of facts that can be talked about, we demand that people have good reasons for what they believe. And if they believe something strongly without evidence, and it's clear that their reasons are just a matter of, are nothing more than their conviction, or their reasons that can't be articulated, those people are quickly marginalized certainly from the conversation on those subjects.
You're getting a doctorate right now in neuroscience. You're an expert on neuroscience. Well, is there something about our brains that makes us believe these crazy things?
Well, I think it's, there's been talk about the God gene, and there's certainly some effort afoot to understand religious experience and religious belief at the level of the brain. I think it's unnecessary to await that data. Whatever the truth is at the level of the brain, clearly this is a matter of human conversation. I mean, to allege that there is a genetic basis for religiosity immediately puts forward the mystery as to why the Swedes, only 10% of Swedes, for instance, believe in a God of the sort that 90% believe in America.
Well, they're satanic.
Right. Yeah. Right. Good point. But then you have the Danes and the Japanese and the Australians, and there are dozens of first world societies where secularism really is ascendant, and the United States really is an outlier. I mean, the United States is uniquely religious when you hold it up against Western Europe and places like Canada and Australia. And it's pretty obvious that there is unlikely to be a genetic or neurological difference between the average American and the average Swede. So I don't think it has to be understood at the level of the brain. I mean, I'm seeking to understand belief itself at the level of the brain. But clearly the way in here is conversation and challenging ideas, challenging ascendant ignorance. And we're not even doing that.
We could import more Swedes. Maybe that would help.
That's right. Encourage the Swedes to breed and emigrate. Yeah.
Speaking of ethics, when people stop believing in God, they tend to have sex with sheep. True or false?
Yeah, there's little evidence for that. Although I guess you'd have to go to Sweden to confirm that.
Oh, they're big sheep fuckers in Sweden. I've been there.
Right. Yeah, this link between religious conviction and morality, I think, is an utter myth. And I think this is something I'll tackle in my next book at some length, because it has really, it's the first move religious people make in our culture, at least, to think that without paying lip service to this notion that we have timeless truths codified in some holy book and codified by God, we will just be at sea morally. We will just completely lose our bearings, and there'll be, violence in the streets. There's no evidence for that, and the most atheistic societies in Western Europe, in particular, enjoy standards of living well beyond our own by almost any index that you want to use. And strangely, they are the most generous societies in terms of giving foreign aid to the developing world. The U.S. ranks rather low. I think it's about 20 on the list of donor nations, and the best donors, the Swedes and the Danes and the Norwegians. I mean, these are highly secular, highly atheistic societies. So, yeah, it's a complete fantasy to think that without the belief that God wrote one of our books, we're going to lose morality.
Quoting from your book again, you say, "We can no longer ignore the fact that billions of our neighbors believe in the metaphysics of martyrdom, or in the literal truth of the book of Revelation, or in any of the other fantastical notions that have lurked in the minds of the faithful for millennia, because our neighbors are now armed with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons." Are you being alarmist?
I don't think so. I think that's as tame a articulation of the dangers as I really can imagine, given how I perceive our situation. I think it is just transparently obvious that there is no possible future in which aspiring martyrs are going to make good neighbors. And we are doing, to speak specifically about what's going on in the Muslim world, we are doing nothing to challenge the metaphysics, the metaphysical presuppositions of Islam, and we're doing nothing to encourage a reformation within Islam that challenges these metaphysics, and specifically the metaphysics of martyrdom and jihad. This idea that death in defense of the faith is the highest good. That is really a deal breaker, and it's especially so when you start getting societies that are armed with long-range nuclear weapons, and that's just a matter of time. The nukes, are as we know, are proliferating, and the rocket technology has already been invented, and there's no way to put that knowledge back in the bag. So, how many years do we have to wait before we learn that Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Iran or any other society that still has its 7th century worldview intact now has nukes that can reach any spot on the globe? Maybe it'll be, at best, it'll be 100 years. It'll take nowhere near that long. But it would be magic if it took 100 years. But it's not going to take longer than that. I'm talking about religious faith, and specifically a style of thinking that takes the sting out of death. That really is the core of religion. In geopolitical terms, we want the sting in death. We do not want groups of people well armed who are not afraid to die. That is really the only thing that allowed us to live more or less stably perched on the brink of Armageddon with the Soviet Union was this mutual disinclination to die. And once you start getting the people who are dewy-eyed with their convictions of how beautiful the afterlife is going to be, you start getting those people holding the keys to the missiles, then all bets are off. Then the thing that it's very difficult for secularists and even religious moderates in our culture to realize is that people really do believe this stuff. People really are motivated by the contents of these holy books. People really do fly planes into buildings because they think they're going to get to paradise and they're going to get 72 virgins. And incidentally, if you really believe this stuff, that it is quite rational to do that. It's given what jihadists, to speak of them specifically again, given what jihadists claim to believe, they're acting perfectly rationally. It's not like they're insane and acting chaotically. They are, if you thought that the creator of the universe wanted nothing more than to have infidels killed so that he could torture them for eternity in the fires of hell, and he was just waiting to reward you and your brethren with an eternity of celestial delights, and not only would you get to paradise, but you'd pave the way for all your loved ones to get there after you, it is just unambiguously rational to kill infidels in some Quranically acceptable way. And then all you have to do is split hairs and get a fatwa as to whether or not it's acceptable to fly a plane into a building when what provocation is necessary for that. And people like Osama bin Laden seek those fatwas and do this kind of theological hair splitting.
When you talk like this, you make me think that we're doomed. Are we doomed?
I have no idea. It's hard to see a basis for real optimism here, because I don't even see the rudiments of a reasonable conversation on these subjects happening at the level that it really should happen at.
Okay, so there's a Christian or even just any religious person watching this right now, and they're saying, yeah, what you say makes a lot of sense. You've got logic on your side, you've got reason on your side, you've got evidence on your side, you're really smart, but I feel God in my life.
Right.
How can you possibly deny that?
A few ways, in fact. First of all, we have to look closely at what this claim is. The claim to feel God. How is that different from the claim that a Buddhist would make to feel certain changes in his state of consciousness without any reference to God? I would argue that any Christian or any religious person who is willing to talk merely about the data of their experience and talk about the joy they feel when praying to Jesus, say, or the positive changes in their lives born of the experience of prayer. Such a person, when they look at the experience of a Buddhist, the analogous experience of a Buddhist, will have to see that Buddhists indeed do have that kind of experience. They experience rapture and bliss, and they weep tears of joy in certain devotional circumstances without any reference to Jesus. So invariably what a Christian is doing is first let me back up and acknowledge that there's no doubt that doing the Jesus prayer, for instance, for 18 hours a day is going to radically change your moment-to-moment experience of the world, very likely for the better. Now, a Christian doing that practice will interpret those changes as a confirmation of Christian dogma, as a sign that Jesus really is, in fact, the Son of God, born of a virgin, say. Now, it should be pretty clear that's not the best interpretation of the data. The moment you see a Hindu having more or less the same transformations based on praying to Shiva, and a Buddhist having more or less the same transformations doing a totally non-theistic practice of chanting, say. So there's a deeper principle here. There is just the possibility, the neurological possibility, the psychological possibility of transforming our experience by deliberately using our attention in certain ways. And we have to find some way of talking about that is not parasitic on superstition and mythology and our separate cultural traditions, because the truth is deeper than our separate cultural traditions.
So often these things will start with mishearings, misunderstandings, or misrememberings of things caught too quickly in passing, of things that were sort of half heard, half understood, badly remembered. But it is more the magic of how they continue to spread, in that at each point along the line, each link in the chain, the person who hears the story makes a decision, unknown to them or not, to pass along the tale or to just let it drop. See, when these stories end up being repeated and passed to more and more people, they become a far more accurate reflection of society's inner heart. We tend to pass along the stories we on some level agree with. Therefore, when you see a story that has grown in impetus, it is because something in it resonated deeply with a great number of people.
In a way, it's kind of a mysterious process, because most urban legends, you can never trace them back to a source, not a source in a sense of where this really happened, but how they began in the first place. It seems to be a very collaborative process where somebody somewhere comes up with the germ of a story, somehow either making it up, misremembering something, being inspired by something, and it goes through many hands and it's shaped and it's formed until somehow it just reaches this sort of perfect state where it stops changing except for the details of time and locale, and then it sort of crystallizes in that form. But exactly how it starts and gets shaped and molded into that is kind of mysterious. It's like there's always the debate about, say, evolution, and we don't have how can you say that our ancestors were primates, and there's no half human, half ape kind of a thing, and it's sort of like, where do the legends come from? There's no, proto-urban legend, something that's kind of halfway to being an urban legend, but it just isn't all the way there yet. You don't ever see those. You just see the end result.
Splurge is the name of a particular genre of stories on our site. It was a word coined by a member of our mailing list that both named this particular grouping of stories and described the reaction it sort of raised in her. These tales tend to be, on the surface, inspirational stories filled with dying mothers, sad-eyed children, puppies, kittens, and of course, overall, the great, all-powerful, always benevolent God. Unfortunately, any number of these stories, upon further examination, tend to have a dark underside to them, in that Although they seem to push one message, in reality, they can often push a quite different one.
Example?
Oh, an example? For me, the primary example has to do with a story about a gal who came just this close to being raped. She was about to enter an alleyway and saw a rather frightening-looking individual lurking about. She prayed to the good Lord for guidance, and she passed through that alleyway completely unmolested. Hours later, the police came to get her and took her down to the station, and she identified the man in the lineup as the one who had been lurking in that alleyway. And it was then that she came out that she was there because he'd been arrested for raping another woman. She had a moment to talk to him, apart from the others, and she said, "Well, why didn't you molest me?" And he said, "Well, how could I, with those two great big tall guys walking right beside you?" The message, of course, being that God had sent angels to guide her safely through the danger. And that is a wonderfully comforting story, because it tells us that, well, in times of great danger, we can appeal to a higher power, and He will provide His protection. But the underside to it is that another woman was raped. And did she not pray? Was she not good enough? Was she somehow evil or undeserving? Are all victims of all tragedies evil or undeserving or not worthy of a benevolent God's love and protection? See, to believe in a God who intervenes and who will protect an individual, you have to also believe in a God who will reject the appeals of others, who will not answer certain prayers, or who will basically just cast any number of people into the maw of whatever horrible outcome is about to occur, simply because He doesn't like them as much. They're not as worthy. They're
Well, they
not
were
as
sinners,
good.
though, to be clear.
But are they? Is every rape victim a sinner?
Yeah.
Did every person who was ever hurt by a mugger, was that person somehow not worthy? Every person who's ever been murdered or tortured? See, to believe in this divine protection is also to believe in that there are whole classes of people who obviously deserved the horrors that were visited upon them.
The idea that a god, the son of a high god, had come down into the world, that happened many, many times. Asclepius, Hermes, many, many other ones. The miraculous, the Annunciation, Apollonius of Tyana, that happens. The god Proteus appears to his mother and said, "You're going to bear a divine child." Well, who's it going to be? It'll be me in human form. And then there's a miraculous event, and he's born. Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, loads of others had, both in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, had these miraculous births. Sometimes virgins, but not the husband in any case. Then there's the child prodigy story. There are modern and ancient examples of that, but it's pretty widespread that he's really a god. He already knows everything. Then he goes on to heal people. Well, Asclepius healed all sorts of people. Apollonius of Tyana did. Apollonius was a major exorcist like Jesus, because they know who he is. And the messianic secret thing, where Jesus tells everybody to shut up, like Dennis Ronald MacDonald pointed out, that could well come from the Odyssey. Once Odysseus gets home, he tells everybody to keep it under wraps. The crowning of Jesus, that's part of, by the people. They hail the Son of David and all that. As Dundas points out, that's a classic part of the mythic hero archetype. But then the same people turn on him. The same kind of reversal happens there. I forgot to say the persecution by a tyrant when he's an infant. That's told of Caesar Augustus, Moses, Krishna, Zoroaster, and so on and so on. The Passion narrative, that's most like the dying and rising God thing, but even if you secularize it and have him stand trial before the Roman procurator, there's a very similar one in Apollonius's life, where he's made to stand trial before the Emperor Domitian and miraculously gets out of it. The notion of post-mortem appearances, Romulus, who vanishes during a battle, no one can find any trace of him. He appears several times to the senators and others, and he says in one version, "I've now become the god Quirinus." In another one he said, "I was a god and came to earth." But in any event, they say he was a king of Rome, and he said, "One day Rome will become a great empire if you guys go forth and spread my worship," and so on. Apollonius even appears in a doubting Thomas story to one disciple who just cannot believe in immortality and figures even the sage is dead, even though he's ascended bodily into heaven. And Apollonius appears to him, though no one else can see him, and convinces him that indeed he's immortal, and so will the disciple be. The empty tomb stories, you find a few of those in contemporary novels, like Cariton's Kyrios and Calirrhoe, where this guy's lover has been killed, he thinks, though she's only in a coma. She's been prematurely buried in an opulent tomb, and he comes to visit, but in the meantime, the tomb robbers, seeing that it is a rich person's tomb figure, there must be all kinds of goodies in there they can steal, so they open it up, and she's reviving, and they don't want a witness left of their theft, so they kidnap her. Here come her friends and relatives to find the tomb open, and the grave clothes left there, and says, "Oh, the gods have taken her up. They were jealous of me and my love," and then he realizes that no, she's just been kidnapped, and goes off to find her. And in the course of the adventure, he gets crucified but survives it. And the same thing happens in a few more of these novels all around the 2nd century. Well, you got crucified heroes that survive the cross. You got people that are entombed alive in rich people's tombs to attract tomb robbers. And then you have a final reunion scene where they think, "You must be a ghost. I gave you up for dead long ago. No, it's really me." You begin to think all of this stuff was well known. These are popular novels and popular myths and so forth. Is it pure coincidence that this stuff shows up in the Gospels? I don't think so. I just don't see how you can say, "Oh, no, none of that matters." I'm a big comic book fan. Suppose you said, well, Batman, the Martian Manhunter, the Green Lantern, well, these are clearly just fiction, but Superman, now that really happened. There's just no reason to think that. They're all comic books. And so I just see the same thing. In fact, there's this great 60s story about Superboy. He somehow gets a hold of a history book from the future. He can travel through time. And he sees in this history book that they say, well, there used to be many fantastic characters of folklore that never existed. Santa Claus, William Tell, Paul Bunyan, and Superboy. Hey, what's this? And so he goes into the future to demonstrate to these people that he was a real historical figure. Well, though the joke's on the reader, right? Because there wasn't a Superboy. Even this is just a story. And it seems to me that's what's going on with all these apologists. Yeah, this dying and rising God who went through the whole thing, this one is true. Apollonius of Tyana, oh, no, that's just silly. But Jesus, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I don't think it would be better if there were no Jesus. It's a matter of indifference. And there might have been, but it just seems to me the burden of proof is on the person that would say that there was, because it's just special pleading again. You want special treatment for your favorite savior. I mean, why are there no Mithraists or Apollonius